This is episode 648 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am pleased to be joined this week by Trent England. He is the founder and executive director of Save Our States. Save Our States is an organization that works on defending the Electoral College and opposing ranked choice voting and perhaps other issues that we can discuss in this program. But welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Trent.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, well, you've had your whirlwind here. You were based in Oklahoma City, and got to do an event in Clovis as well as a luncheon in Albuquerque. But um, just why the Electoral College? What got you excited about defending that particular institution? And what is the Electoral College?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the Electoral College, obviously, it's the way we elect the president, right? It's in the Constitution. It's a two-step democratic process. You can find it in Article 2, Section 1, with a slight modification made by the 12th Amendment, which all the way back in 1804. But ever since 1804, the constitutional framework has been the same. I got really excited about this when I was in college back in the 1990s. I had a professor. He had been on the United States Senate Judiciary Committee staff in the 1970s and had helped defend the Electoral College at that time against a constitutional amendment proposal. These things had been kind of percolating around Congress since the 1950s. And Mike Ullman wrote this report that became famous because it really set forth an argument, a bipartisan argument about why the Electoral College benefits the United States over time, why it's really foundationally important to our constitutional system of states, to checks and balances, to having a politics that is just more inclusive, more national rather than being regional. And some of the points that he made really showed how the Electoral College works even better than the founders thought it would. And all that really intrigued me. And then when we had the 2000 election, and then the launch of, I'm sure we'll talk about this national popular vote campaign that's really trying to nullify the Electoral College. I just wanted to do my part to share with Americans what I think is something that's fascinating and also really important to the future of our country.
Very nice. So you got involved in this effort, and it was the 2000 election that really set in motion this attempt to, in many ways, overturn the Electoral College, but not in the typical way, which would be to just pass a law or amend the U.S. Constitution. And that's what you would have to do theoretically for a fundamental change. But some clever people, clever not in a good way, clever in a bad way, figured out a process that they think can overturn the Electoral College without amending the U.S. Constitution. Talk about that.
Yeah, so the basic idea that a couple of law professors came up with after Al Gore lost in 2000 was, what if you could take the Electoral College, leave it in place, don't change the Constitution, that's too hard, but force the Electoral College to rubber stamp the popular vote result. Now, that sounds probably pretty far-fetched, but what you have to realize is that the founders left the power over how to choose presidential electors to state legislatures. Now, right away, at the very beginning of our country, legislatures started to say, well, look, we could choose them ourselves, right? Or we could do various things, but we're going to have the people of our state vote to choose our presidential electors. That makes a lot of sense, made a lot of sense in 1796, 1800, makes a lot of sense today. Every state does it that way today. Maine and Nebraska do it by congressional district, and then the remaining two presidential electors statewide. But New Mexico and 47 other states just vote statewide, choose all of their presidential electors that way. But what if, excuse me, what if you had a state just ignore the outcome in your own state and choose presidential electors based on the nationwide popular vote? If you had enough states do that, then you would basically connect enough electoral votes to the nationwide popular vote, that you could force the Electoral College to rubber stamp the popular vote result. And that is what now is called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. It's this scheme to basically turn the Electoral College into a zombie, right? You leave it in place, right? It still appears like it's there, but it's not operating the way it was designed to operate. It's not serving the purposes it was designed to serve. You basically force it to rubber stamp this other election process that doesn't have the same kinds of checks and balances. It's very concerning. Nothing in the Constitution says you can't do this. There are reasons why I think it should be found unconstitutional, but it's a close case. It's a hard case, and I think the best way to fight back against it is to educate Americans and to educate state legislatures so that they don't try to go down this national popular vote compact pathway.
So why would that be a bad thing? Why is the Electoral College superior to the national popular vote mechanism?
Yeah, the important insight that the American founders had is that if you just have one big direct election in a really big and diverse country, and even back in the 1790s, we were already a pretty big place, geographically large, for our time, right? A relatively large population. And I mean, obviously a lot smaller than it is today, right? But still, we're talking about a whole bunch of people spread over the eastern seaboard of what is the United States, and very diverse. And some states were very big, some states were very small. Some cities were already, again, it's all relative, but for their time, some cities were big. Most people lived in small towns or on farms. They recognized that a national popular vote means that the big cities, the biggest states would have a lot of power. And potentially you could have politics sort of form around that reality, where you would have the biggest states, if they were making their decisions, sort of holding together, the biggest states would control who became president, not just in one election, right, but in every election, and everybody else would be left out, would know that they were being left out. That's not a good process. What they recognize is if you have a two-step process, that forces coalition building, right? What the Electoral College says with its checks and balances is that, California, you get a lot of power. You got a lot of people. That means you got a lot of House seats. That means you've got a lot of electoral votes. That means you have a lot of power because you have a lot of people there. But there's an upper limit on how much power you can have, right? New York, upper limit on how much power you can have. Those are the checks. And the checks cause balance, right? The checks mean that because California and New York and Illinois and Texas and Florida, because they can only get so much power within that system, the political parties have to reach out. They have to build a coalition that includes mid-sized states, includes small states, and our politics is very national. We don't really have a regional kind of politics, right? The Democrats are present everywhere. I live in one of the reddest states in the country right now. I live in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma has a very active Democratic Party. Right. And Texas has a very active Democratic Party. They've actually been trying to flip Texas, right? They're trying to turn Texas purple. The Republicans are present in Vermont. They're present in California. Republicans have been trying to make, they're trying to flip Virginia back. They've been trying to make inroads in New Jersey, right? Where you've had some Republican statewide candidates come close in the last few cycles. We don't have the kind of fractured, fragmented, niche party, regional party system that you see in some other countries because we have this two-step democratic process that we use to elect the president.
And, it's not just that balancing of the states. Right now, as you mentioned in your presentations, it's really kind of an urban versus rural divide in American politics. Would you say that's the fundamental divide that the Electoral College protects? Obviously, bigger cities lead to bigger populations at the state level, but that is kind of the fundamental philosophical divide these days. The Electoral College kind of balances out.
Yeah, and it's a challenge to talk about it because we're so used to talking in terms of states that it is important to remember if the Electoral College were to go away, either because we changed the Constitution or because it was just nullified by the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, the state lines would basically be erased from presidential elections. There would be, which of course there would still be some other way that campaigns would look at it. They hire pollsters and consultants. They're still going to slice and dice up the electorate. It would really become about media markets. I think, it's kind of, those are built around the biggest cities, really oftentimes collections of cities. You've got you've got people talking about Los Angeles, but it's actually a dozen big cities that are all smushed together there. The twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, plus some other suburbs there, right? You have these bigger urban areas, these big media markets. That's what would matter, and we see that divide in politics today. I mean, it's no surprise that the push for national popular vote really comes from California, comes primarily in this case from San Francisco. That's where the folks who are pushing it are from, and yeah, if what you want is to take urban progressive politics and nationalize it, right? If you want to take the urban progressive view of things, this kind of more, what a lot of people today call this, woke progressive view, that the polls show that that is not a popular idea when you get outside of the big cities, not at all. And the Electoral College says to those folks, right? Well, you've got to moderate. I mean, you can't just take your big city politics and win presidential elections, because you got to build this big coalition. Which is why right now, I'm sure people listening to the program will have noticed, you've got the Harris Walls campaign running around saying we love guns, we love fracking, right? We're gun owners and hunters, and we would never push a Green New Deal and all this. Right now that they have to run for president, they all of a sudden care about rural voters in Pennsylvania, suburban voters, in Wisconsin. They care about, people who are outside of the big cities, and they're desperately trying to moderate their positions. And I think that the folks who are trying to get rid of the Electoral College, and again, it's through this clever mechanism that basically nullifies the Electoral College. The folks who are trying to do that, right? They don't like that. They don't like that kind of coalition building. It's frustrating to them. They want the big cities to have more power, and so I think it's easy to understand why they want what they want. I think it's also pretty easy to recognize just how short-sighted that is.
And this is nothing new. This kind of geographical divide in American politics is as old as the republic itself, so to speak. Talk about some of those past historical examples. I mean, if there's from the founding, that's great, but I know that the founders obviously contemplated that. I don't know what those issues specifically were at the time, but certainly later on in American politics, there became some very fundamental issues that the Electoral College helped to kind of moderate.
Yeah, at the time of the founding, the focus really was on these states, and I mean, it's hard for us to wrap our minds around it today, because people really had a lot of loyalty to their states, because as colonies, they were individual sovereigns within the British system. And so, Virginia's connection to Maryland politically ran through London. And, while legally that changed with with the constitutional system, culturally that changed slowly over time. And so the debates around the Electoral College really were kind of, pitting the small states against the large states. And you had people in Delaware, for example, basically saying, we're not going to join this union unless we have some protections that make sure that big states don't just control everything. And they didn't have to join the union. I mean, these compromises are the reason why we have a country, the reason why we have a constitution. And of course, they've worked out very well. They're very successful, which I think, you sort of alluding to the historical progression and the way that we've seen the Electoral College enact with American politics over time. It has forced our political parties to reach out, even when that was very awkward. And the best example, I think, is after the Civil War. As Reconstruction is starting to break down, the Democrats become extremely popular in the South for a collection of reasons. Some of it's vote suppression, but the fact is, Democrats were winning Southern states in many cases with over 70% of the vote, sometimes over 80% of the vote. And when you do that, right, when you have a region of the country where you are intensely popular. And frankly, when you have total one party control of state governments, it makes it a lot easier to commit election fraud. And there certainly was a lot of vote suppression and other kinds of election fraud in those states at that time. The Democrats could actually win the national popular vote, but they couldn't win the Electoral College, right? They were winning the most popular votes, 1876, 1884. There are some historical nuances here, but so skipping over some of the muddy details, they were winning the national popular vote, couldn't win the Electoral College. And what the Democrats end up doing, because of our constitutional system of checks and balances, because of the Electoral College, is they effectively say, look, sure, they had some really terrible elements of their coalition in the South, including the Ku Klux Klan, right? Like terrible, racist, violent elements of the Democrat Party coalition at that time in the 1870s, 1880s. They said, look, we actually don't need their support. What we need is Irish and German Catholic immigrants in the North, right? Some of the least popular people in the United States at the time, particularly in these northern cities, right? People who the Republican Party didn't want anything to do with because they basically said, we're going to win these states anyway. We don't like these Catholic immigrants, so we don't want them in our party. And the Democrats say, well, if this is the only way we can win the presidency, we don't really want him in our party either, but we're going to take him. We're going to work hard. We're going to bring him into our party. And this is the reason why, say, the Kennedy family winds up in the Democratic Party coalition, because the Democrats are up in Massachusetts telling these new immigrants from Ireland, join our coalition. We want you in our party because the Constitution says it's the only way to have a chance of winning the presidency. That is the intersection of practical politics and the Constitution, in a good Constitution, right? A Constitution that is thoughtfully built with these checks and balances, not with some fuzzy language about we want to feel good about some vague idea of democracy, but a government that's actually designed to work well over time under pressure, right? The Constitution forced the political parties to reach out, broaden their appeal. That was good for the Democratic Party at the time. It's good for the Republican Party. It's good for the entire country. And it's very unfortunate you have people right now who are so short-sighted trying to effectively get rid of the Electoral College with national popular vote, who just don't recognize how important all this is, and the fact that their plan would open the door to billionaire candidates running, you might have somebody running to the left of the Democratic Party, somebody running to the right of the Republican Party. You might have, Oprah and Michael Bloomberg running, claiming to be in the middle, right? And you could wind up with somebody winning the presidency because they have really strong support from one narrow region of the country that gave them 28% of the vote. And you got, 5 other candidates who all got less than 28% of the vote. That's the kind of politics that the National Popular Vote Compact would open the door to, versus the kind of, sure, it's awkward, and, the Democrats wish they didn't have to moderate, and the Republicans wish they didn't have to reach out so much. But those incentives created by the Constitution are what have allowed us to be a very successful, very inclusive country over our history.
Yeah, and you mentioned the evolution of the Democratic Party from a Southern party to a more national party. I mean, people don't realize FDR. That guy was as liberal is, not just economically, but for the time socially. But yet he had the entire South under that Democratic banner, which was not much more enlightened in the 1930s and 40s than it was in the 1870s and 80s. It's shows the power of those political coalitions and how they needed to work in this country.
That's right. And I think it's important for Americans to recognize one of the reasons why the founders were so effective at creating and running a government is that they lived in the real world. And what I mean is they thought historically. They didn't think theoretically. What we see in the criticisms of the Electoral College is people thinking theoretically. And frankly, what we see in a lot of other criticisms of, some of the conversations lately about trying to rewrite the First Amendment to give government more power against misinformation And and you see this in a lot of contemporary conversations about economic policy. And if we just tinker a little more here and give government a little more power over there, it's people thinking theoretically and not historically, right? The founders thought that was dangerous, right? You don't sit in your armchair and and sort of come up with an idea that makes sense to you. You go, you do the hard work of studying history, you look for things that worked, you look for things that didn't work, and you try to learn the lessons and kind of draw the through line up to where you are today so that you can make good policy that works. And that's what we need to do today. We need to look at what actually works. If people think that our politics today has gotten too messy, too dangerous, too unsettled, right, too nasty, whatever it is, well, the solution is not, some college professor came up with an idea how we can change this. The solution is, well, when was it better, right? If it was better in the 1980s, well, what reforms have we passed since then that maybe are causing the problem, right? But seldom do we get those kind of conversations, reassessing some of these, generally policies that have given government more and more and more power over our lives. I mean, people forget that the more power we give government over our lives, the more politics matters in a very practical way, right? It becomes this one size fits all system, where it feels very winner takes all. And the electoral college, protecting the electoral college is just one piece of sort of protecting this constitutional system and trying to get back to a kind of politics that I think most Americans actually realize used to work a lot better.
And it's not just the Democrats who have kind of moderated their policies over the years with regard to the Electoral College. The Republicans have done the same in a different way. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, just recently there's been in this cycle, and especially in 2016, there's been a lot of focus on Republican outreach to Hispanic voters. That's been very successful. I mean, even going back before 2016, I mean, we're old enough to remember when Florida was a purple state, and Democrats were predicting that. I mean, this is you go back 25 years ago, and there were a lot of Democrats who said Florida will become a Democratic state, and even more than that, the United States will become, the progressives are going to have this durable coalition, this sort of overwhelming political coalition, because the population is getting younger, and there are, and particularly Hispanics, right? Very fast growing segment of the American population. I remember sitting in a presentation like that in the year 2000 thinking, this is frankly really insulting to American voters. And also it misunderstands the way politics changes, right? Politics is always changing. Both parties are always trying to figure out how to have a coalition that can win. Republicans were so successful with Hispanic voters in Florida, uh, that Florida is now pretty solidly has been, for several cycles, pretty solidly red state. And Republicans got a little bit concerned about Texas and doubled down in their outreach to Hispanic voters in Texas. And that's been very successful. They have, thus far, the predictions of Texas going purple have just not turned out to be accurate. And so, I think we should appreciate the reasons for that. Like, that's very healthy. It's very good that the Republican Party is reaching out and bringing in younger voters, Hispanic voters, different groups of people who haven't traditionally supported Republicans. That's a great thing for not just the Republican Party, but again, it's good. It's good for American politics. It's good for American life to have our parties be big and diverse and real coalitions of different kinds of people. And the Electoral College is just constantly prodding us to do that. It's a healthy, good thing.
Now, one of the issues that a lot of people are concerned about, certainly President Trump, although he hasn't talked about it quite as much this cycle, but the issue of voter fraud. And, we always see these results and outcomes coming from individual states, the swing states, and um, it's frustrating to watch, especially if your candidate's ahead on election night, and then you inevitably have to go to bed, and you wake up, and things aren't the way they were when you went to sleep, and there's there's reasonable concerns about electoral fraud. How does the Electoral College mitigate against some forms of voter fraud?
Yeah, I'll give you sort of my crassest example, and then and then dive into the details a little bit, right? But the proverbial Chicago cemetery. I'm not saying this happens today or it doesn't, right?
Or
But
New Mexico
or New
cemetery?
Mexico, yeah. I mean, the this was a common meme in American politics, right? That the cemeteries in Chicago would vote at 110% turnout. Uh, with the Electoral College, if that's happening, it only affects the electoral votes in Illinois, right? The Electoral College contains election disputes or even administrative problems, right? The hurricane, right? Hurricane Helene is causing problems with election administration in Georgia, in North Carolina. It's going to be an issue down there. But those things are contained. It affects those states, right? Florida in 2000, right, had election administration problems. They were contained in that one state. And Florida has been able to change its laws, change its practices, and fix those problems. They didn't have to go to Washington, D.C., didn't have to go through Congress, right? Florida was able to unilaterally solve its election problems, and they have been extremely successful doing that over the last 25 years. The Electoral College basically turns the states into the equivalent of the watertight compartments of an ocean liner, where the ocean liner strikes an iceberg, and maybe it floods a compartment, but it doesn't sink the whole ship, right? Maybe we have an election problem in one state. Maybe people don't trust the outcomes over here. There's a natural disaster over there, but at least those things are contained, which makes it a lot easier to work through them. The alternative is not just that you kind of lose those compartments, but election fraud in American history has always been more common in one party jurisdictions. This is kind of obvious, right? If and talk again about the South. When one party controlled every level of government in the South, right? And there were no, I mean, there have been elections in some places where they simply refused to put the other party on the ballot at all, right? So you wind up with 100% vote for one party, which seems like a kind of election fraud to me. But that that situation, right? The Electoral College, that means that if you have a place that's controlled by one party, right? There's not really any reason to commit vote fraud there, right? If they are, I mean, you saw Democrats complaining about the election in Georgia, saying that Republicans were stealing the elections in Georgia a couple of years ago in the governor's race there. But if that's true, right? Again, it's contained in Georgia, and you can figure that out. With the national popular vote, it's not just fraud. It's that a state like California could, if you had the national popular vote in effect, California could lower its voting age to 15, right? Allow 15, 16, 17-year-olds to vote. I assume that they would vote similarly to adult Californians, right? Which means it would add a lot of votes for the Democrats. And so Democrats in the California state legislature might be interested in doing that. There's no prohibition on a state lowering its voting age. And if they thought they could throw an extra, 400,000 votes into the national popular vote total by lowering their voting age, maybe they also put polling places in prisons or whatever, right? If they think that they can add a few 100,000 votes to the Democrat total, again, right now, that just affects the outcome in California, which means it's probably not going to affect the outcome at all. But if you had a national popular vote, all of a sudden California could potentially add in, as many voters as you have in the entire state of New Mexico, by changing their election laws in some ways that I think most people think would be foolish, but it certainly would give them more power.
Yeah, and prisoners and really, you could get into, I think, some very fraudulent behavior because the incentive is limited. I mean, I'm not saying there's no incentive towards voter fraud among certain public officials, but if you just go with a straight national popular vote, it definitely changes the incentive structure in a way that promotes that kind of behavior for sure.
That's right. And it makes everybody else sort of subject to the lowest common denominator in election laws. You were talking about, you go to bed on election night and you wake up and the results are different. I mean, if you live in a state like I do, that doesn't happen at the state level because we have good election laws. People vote on paper, mostly in person, overwhelmingly in person in Oklahoma. They have to have the ballots in by election night. And so, typically the polls close and within oftentimes 45 minutes, at least within a couple hours, we actually know the outcome of any election unless it's really, really close. But if, with the terrible election laws that they have in states like California and Washington State, where I used to live, and they allow ballots to trickle in for days and days and days after election day, which means that, with a national popular vote, all the rest of our states would be kind of held hostage to the states that have the worst election laws in the country to finalize the results. I mean, it wouldn't be a good thing. We need those states to fix their practices. And frankly, I think we need I think we need Congress to really remind, or maybe the courts to remind states that federal law says when election day is, and the idea that we have like election season drawn out over the course of several months now, to me seems like it violates federal law.
Now, real quickly, you do before we get to the ranked choice voting aspect, which in many ways is also a threat here in New Mexico, but debunk the myth that other countries do that national popular vote concept, because that is not the case.
Yeah. I see this all the time. The claim that we're the only country with anything like the Electoral College. We're the only country where, one candidate can get more votes and the other candidate wins the election. Every other country has a national popular vote for their executive. All those things are false. I mean, they're just absolutely demonstrably false. There are countries that have a national popular vote, but when you think about the major democratic countries of the world, they're parliamentary systems. There's no direct election for prime minister. That's not how a parliamentary system works. That's not how it works in Canada. In the last two Canadian elections, the Conservative Party got more votes than the Liberal Party, but the Liberal Party won more seats in Parliament because, again, it's essentially a two-step democratic process, right? The Liberal Party won more seats in Parliament, therefore they elected the prime minister. In any of these parliamentary systems, it can work out in this same way, right? They are two-step processes. Our electoral college is actually more directly democratic than a parliamentary system. And India and Germany, which wrote constitutions in the middle of the 20th century, created electoral colleges. Those big, large, diverse population, democratic systems, they have versions. They're different from ours, but they are versions of an electoral college because they wanted those kind of checks and balances in their systems as well.
Excellent. Well, I think you've made the case for the Electoral College. Let's turn our attention to ranked choice voting. Now, I know for a fact that Santa Fe and Las Cruces, they're two major cities in New Mexico. Somewhat shocking, but welcome that the largest city in our state does not have ranked choice voting right here in Albuquerque. But there are plenty of politicians, including the mayor, who would like to do that. Why would that be a bad idea?
Well, I think people should ask themselves, do you want your elections to be more complicated? Do you want your ballots to be more complicated? Do you want the instructions that go with your ballots to be more complicated and a lot longer? Do you want it to take longer to vote, to fill out a ballot? Do you want those ballots to have a lot more opportunities for people to make mistakes that get their ballots thrown out? Do you want it to be harder for people to understand the election outcomes? And do you want to make it a lot harder to verify the election outcomes and actually prove that elections are honest, right? Because ranked choice voting, unfortunately, does all of these things. MIT did a study a few years ago that found that ranked choice voting decreases people's trust in elections, makes people more skeptical that the system is somehow rigged against them. It increased the amount of negativity in elections, which goes exactly opposite of what ranked choice voting advocates claim. And in most cases, it does not save any money. Now, if you are collapsing elections, right, if you're eliminating a primary or a runoff or something, then you might save money with ranked choice voting. But even there, oftentimes it requires new election hardware. It always requires new election software. It requires a lot of training for election officials. They also typically will do a big public education campaign to re-educate voters about how to vote their ballots, right? So it's always funny to me because ranked choice voting advocates will say, oh, it's not that complicated. And then they turn around and put their hand out and say, but we need a few $1,000,000 to go out and educate voters, which, by the way, when they do that, and we've seen this now in New York City and in the state of Oregon, what they do is they create a big slush fund for left-wing groups to go out and do voter outreach to left-wing voters, which I think is, I mean, frankly, is one of the most crooked, despicable things that happens in American elections today is when you see taxpayer money being used in just nakedly partisan ways. In Oregon, they hired a progressive activist to run their program, dishing out money from this taxpayer-funded slush fund, supposedly educating voters about how to use ranked choice voting in Multnomah County. It was just, I mean, it is so, it just should be so offensive, even for progressives who are on that side of things, right? You would wish that there would be some adults in the room who would stand up and say, this is illegitimate, politics. It seems like it's straight out of the 19th century. Ranked choice voting, it's not good for anybody. So we're working against it. We've got a nationwide coalition. We're definitely looking right now at states where it's on the ballot. It's on the ballot in Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Nevada, Arizona. There's a repeal measure on the ballot in Alaska. There's also a bill to ban it in the state constitution in Missouri. So a lot of states out here in the West are considering, ranked choice voting in different ways. And I think we'll find out a lot after this election, just what people think about it, especially up in Alaska where they enacted it in 2020. They used it in one cycle, and then you had this massive uprising of volunteers gathering signatures to put this on the ballot and repeal it. Most people think that it's probably going to be repealed in Alaska, but we'll find out. There seems to be a lot of buyer's remorse when people try ranked choice voting.
All right. Well, and you mentioned a case in Oakland where there was actually an erroneous election result due to ranked choice voting.
Yeah, it was fascinating. We've made all these predictions, right? That it makes elections less transparent, more confusing. It's hard for voters, hard for election officials. And then you had this election in Alameda County. California allows ranked choice voting in municipalities at the county level. They have an option of using it. And so Alameda County uses it. They had a school board race in Oakland. Not a complicated election. They had 3 candidates, few thousand voters, right? It's not a huge election. Most ranked choice voting elections are a lot more complicated than this. And they certified the election, counted the votes, certified the election, swore in the school board candidate who they said had won. And the Friday before Christmas in 2022, some researchers, some guys at a college, called up Alameda County and said, we reran your numbers. We're just doing some research. We didn't think you'd made a mistake or anything, but we were just doing some research. We're looking at the data, and we're getting different numbers. We think you made a mistake. Alameda County had to rerun the results of all of their ranked choice voting elections. Thankfully, they were really lucky. It only changed the results of one election there. But it turned out that some voters had kind of made a mistake with their ballots. The computers were programmed wrong. So you've got confused voters, confused election officials, and then ranked choice voting, you feed it all into a computer. It's not intuitive. It's not obvious. It's not transparent. Nobody had noticed. Nobody had really thought about this. And, they just trusted the computers, which is what ranked choice voting people say you should do. They say, oh, you can just trust the computers. We use computers all the time, right? And so nobody knew there was a mistake until late December. They had to rerun the numbers. They had to have a court order to recertify the election. It turned out that the loser was the real winner. The winner was the real loser. It's just a disaster, and it proved everything that we've said about the problems with ranked choice voting.
All right. Well, great information there, Trent. And if folks want to find out more about your organization, how do they do that?
So people can go to saveourstates.com and connect with us there. Connect with us on social media at Save Our States. We love to work with activists in New Mexico and all around the country.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Great to see you here in New Mexico, and safe travels back to Oklahoma City, where you are based. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.